everybody, and welcome to today's webcast, Introduction to Azure Synapse Analytics. So my name is Ben Dunmire. I'm a business intelligence and analytics consultant at Thorogood. I'm speaking to you today remotely from Philadelphia, and I'm joined by my colleague, Deb Lee. Both Deb and I have kind of experience in designing and delivering end-to-end data and analytics solutions. So Synapse Analytics is a tool we're pretty interested in to just really understand how it fits in the Azure ecosystem and some of its capabilities. So our goal for today is really to kind of talk about what we're hearing from Microsoft, what some of the documentation is revealing, and kind of the key things that we're really thinking about for this new service. Just to briefly look at the agenda here, we'll do a quick intro of Thorogood. We'll give a bit of an overview of the Synapse Analytics tool just to kind of ground ourselves in what it can do. And then Deb will kind of walk through some of the implications and some of those things I mentioned that we're kind of thinking about and playing around with our heads about kind of how the service works. And then we'll close out with just kind of some ideas on getting started. So for those of you who don't know us, Thorogood is an independent global professional services firm. We specialize in business intelligence and analytics strategies, solutions, and services with a focus on our customers. We are a global organization, so we have offices in New York, Philadelphia, London, Bangalore, India, Singapore, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. All of our consultants are recruited and trained in the same way to develop a unique mix of skills, blending business understanding in the form of kind of industry and functional experience with strong technical aptitude and a deep understanding of analytical tools and techniques. We do offer a full range of BI and analytics services, including strategy and roadmaps, requirements design, implementation, and training and support. In terms of the technologies we work with, we are an independent consulting firm, so meaning we don't work with one specific technology, but work and partner with many of the key players in the market in order to provide our clients with the solution that best suits their needs. In line with today's topic, we have been a Microsoft Gold partner for just over 15 years and hold a number of gold competencies. Our partnership really gives us a great interface into Microsoft development teams, allowing for open communication, and also the ability to kind of give feedback to Microsoft from us and from our customers. So after that quick intro on Thorogood, I think it'd be good just to talk a bit about Synapse Analytics and what it can do. So I'll share a few slides on that and kind of talk through how it's being positioned and how it fits in. So here is a common and kind of generic slide to talk through. If we think about the current industry standard and kind of the needs that are coming from businesses, the needs for a high velocity of data, massive volumes of data in various different forms and maturities, we think about kind of different types of data storage. So you can see across the bottom the concept of an ad hoc data store where things are a bit more flexible, there's less structure, there's kind of one-off exploration, you could think of it as, or experimentation even. Then as that data becomes a bit more stable, as we apply business logic to it, we need a bit of more form and function around it. Kind of think about an agile data store, something like maybe like a data lake. And then as that evolves, and we need even stronger processes, kind of consistencies such as indexes and keys and referential integrity, something like an enterprise data store, like a data mart or data warehouse, where you have kind of very strong processes. And all these different types of data storage and stores really exist together. And you can see there might be a kind of pattern of something going from a one-off analysis all the way to something very structured or falling in between. But what it really demands is kind of an architecture and ecosystem that's very flexible, lots of different needs and use cases. And you can see the different types of tools along the top that we might want to use, whether it's visualization or analytics or just one-off queries and analysis. But you have to think about all these different ways in which we're storing data and making it available. And that's really one of the things that modern data architectures answer and try to achieve, and something that I think we'll want to balance our conversation on Synapse for. So if we talk a little bit more about Synapse, just a kind of base definition, it is kind of an evolution of SQL Data Warehouse, which is a kind of an existing tool. But really what Synapse is looking to do is it's looking to take data warehousing, big data capabilities, along with data integration and a lot of other functionalities into a single service. So it's really kind of bringing together a lot of the end-to-end data analytics that we're familiar with into a single service offering. And if we think back to what the kind of previous slide, we kind of have this concept of data warehousing. Data is organized in a structured way. We have obviously tables and views and columns and these different concepts such as keys and referential integrity, transactions. So it's been around for a while, traditional data warehousing and different concepts. And it's meant to be kind of very high performing and have a very kind of structured setup. And then another kind of key concept we have, and something that's really taken off over the last couple of years, is the concept of a data lake, or sometimes we'll think of it as big data. This is where we have file-based storage. It's meant for a bit more of kind of experimentation and agility. We're storing things in a bit more flexible way. We can work with different types of data, not just columnar data, but maybe semi-structured, PDFs and things of that nature. And I think one of the misconceptions that I think we often have is that it's one or the other, or that a data lake has replaced data warehousing, but that's not really the case. We would expect both of these concepts of data storage to work with one another, and they fulfill kind of different needs. Certainly there's some overlap, but you would want your kind of ecosystem to work pretty seamlessly between these two. There are things that data warehousing is very good at. There's things that data lakes are very good at, and together they can be a pretty powerful combination. And with that kind of basis, we think about, why are we talking about Synapse? Why does Synapse fit in with here? What Synapse is kind of aimed at doing is bringing together data warehousing, where they have kind of the massively parallel processing SQL engine, so a very big, strong engine, with big data analytics. So you kind of working with a data lake and preparing and transforming data in raw structures and in flat files into something else. So really, if we think about Synapse, it's kind of promoting this cohesion and this collaborative nature of a data ecosystem, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how that goes. But this is kind of giving us a basis of where does Synapse kind of fit in when we think about our base architecture. I'd like to briefly talk a bit about the kind of evolution. So I mentioned that the Synapse is at this point, it's kind of just been rebranded really, but it's kind of the next evolution of SQL Data Warehouse, which the tool has been around for a number of years now. The data warehouse just is a massively parallel processing relational store. So it's a relational database that, under the hood, it can kind of distribute processing across a couple of nodes. So the thinking is that, very large volumes, very complicated queries, or, a lot of concurrent queries are kind of accomplished by data warehouse. So it's that technology is still part of Synapse, but there's a lot of other pieces. So if we think about kind of that progression, and here's just kind of a visual that Microsoft has shared, you can see all the different pieces. So, at the base of it is certainly the relational storage, the data warehouse, but there's a lot of other pieces in it. So you can see the concept of Polybase that's connecting to data lake storage. So that's the idea of connecting directly using like a SQL query to a data lake. We have a Spark engine. So Spark is a kind of middleware that forms a bit of a middleware between programming languages and kind of data storage. So adding in a Spark engine, integration with Power BI and machine learning interfaces. So some of those tools that Microsoft already has, kind of them fitting in. We can also think about data integration. So the idea of moving data from place to place, building pipelines that transform and prep your data for whatever analyses or applications that you have. And then something that's kind of still in preview is a kind of user interface. So a web-based, browser-based interface where you can kind of manage and edit and control all these sorts of things. So you can see kind of we started with data warehouse, a kind of relational database, and now there's a lot of different parts that are coming into a single service. So that's kind of really the premise of Synapse. And I think I'd mentioned that Synapse is currently what's called private preview, which means that you essentially need to get kind of opted in by Microsoft to start using the tool. If we think about the roadmap, it'll go to then a public preview and then eventually general availability. And we don't quite know what those timings are. There's different lead times depending on the service, depending on kind of what comes out during beta testing. But it's still in that very early stages of kind of Microsoft slowly rolling it out and kind of bringing organizations on board. So it's an interesting time to start thinking about it for sure. And the last bit I'll quickly go through here is just some of the key features, and some of these I already talked about, but thought it'd be good to summarize them if we're thinking about, what is it that Synapse can do? What are the sort of functionalities that it has? So the first one I mentioned, and what's really interesting is the ability to kind of query and analyze data, whether it's stored relationally in a database or in flat files, so something like a data lake or blob storage. So pretty powerful kind of capability. The next one being, I mentioned Apache Spark processing. So Spark is a middleware that sits between some type of query interface and language. So Python, Spark, SQL, Scala are different languages, and it effectively translates that language into something that can read from some sort of flat file or data storage. So I can basically it allows us to interact in a distributed manner with something like a data lake or other data sets. We have data integration. So if folks are familiar, Azure Data Factory is an existing service. It's one that's pretty important for modern data architectures, but it's used for kind of process orchestration, data movement, kind of bringing a lot of that functionality and a lot of that same user interface really into Synapse to effectively allow us to create pipelines within the Synapse service. We also have the concept and there's different kind of implementations of this, but the compute that Synapse is kind of providing, and that compute is both Spark and SQL compute. So there's kind of two different pools, and effectively it can be on demand, which means kind of as you request it, it takes a bit of time to spin up and be available, or it can be kind of statically provisioned, saying I want this certain level of compute. And this is we'll talk about it a bit later, but kind of an interesting thing to get right, but effectively kind of scalable up and down and in and out compute. I mentioned the Synapse Studio, which is kind of a centralized user interface, so just kind of a web-based interface to interact with this, along with, I would expect, kind of IDEs that come down the road. Cost-wise, important to understand that Synapse will be split by storage and compute independently. And I think the principle we'd usually want to think about with the cloud is storage is very, very cheap and very easy relative. So it's often thinking about how am I optimizing my compute and doing that in the most responsible manner. And the last bit here is integration with Power BI. So kind of bringing that Power BI, if those are familiar, into the Synapse interface. So it would be interesting to create a couple of visuals off a data set pretty quickly. So we'll see kind of how that evolves. But hopefully this gives here a bit of a sense of some of the capabilities of Synapse. And with that, I'll hand it off to Deb, and she'll talk through, I think, some of what we're thinking about, some of the implications on architecture that are kind of in our minds.
One of the primary focuses for this webcast is to try to sort of delve into, so we've sort of copied the first layer of, we know it's going to all brought together into one unique environment, but what does that actually mean for my business, my existing technical capabilities? Where are some of the opportunities for sort of optimization? What should I be thinking about for this type of tool that's, while it's currently in preview mode, that doesn't mean that you can't be thinking about the impact and some of the sort of key topics here that I've called out that we're going to go through, which will need to be addressed in order to sort of get end-to-end data and analytics solutions off of the ground. So the first one that I'm going to speak to is the optimization of code and pipelines. So if we think about what Synapse is doing, it's bringing together tools like Data Factory and Azure ML, and this is going to present a huge opportunity for companies to sort of review anything that I have that's already existing, potentially recycling it, because what we have seen at a number of our clients within the industry is that a lot of times there are going to be sort of redundant pipelines that are out there because that's just sort of the way it is. And then there's also that sort of key component of optimization. So I think some of the points that Ben had called out around getting the compute right, scalability, this all sort of is going to all play in together into sort of one technology ecosystem, which is pretty unique if you think about what's existed to date. So what I've called out here on the slide are some sort of questions that organizations should be asking themselves. And then I think the main point here is, while there's a huge opportunity to sort of go through your existing code, right, maybe evaluate, do I need to have 3 different pipelines for these steps? Can I sort of parameterize and optimize some of these processes? Does this need to happen in 3 separate instances of Data Factory, or could I have it happen in one instance of Synapse? That's a huge opportunity, right, to get some synergies back. However, the main sort of caution, I think, at the same time is that sort of opening the floodgates without having proper sort of review and putting that time in up front to see what can be consolidated could lead to sort of disjointed processes. It could also lead to issues in scaling up from a productionization standpoint. And then that would sort of be limiting your ability to respond quickly to some of those changing business requirements if things are just sort of migrated without that analytical sort of review of them and not optimized for the best use of the tool. That could potentially lead to some issues in scaling for the business requirements.
And I think also, Deb, the idea of data silos, which we know exists, whether it's silos of ETL or of analytical models or data storage. So interesting to see if Synapse kind of helps to remove some of those silos, remove some of that segmentation, or maybe you need to architect a way to have that type of segmentation, whether it's security related or kind of process oriented. I think another interesting concept with it.
Absolutely, which is a great segue into the next point around DevOps. So I'll let Ben speak to this one.
So for those of you not familiar, the term, or I guess concept of DevOps is really the idea of taking advantage of different kind of software techniques and principles and processes to make us more effective at managing and executing on data and analytics solutions. So I've listed a few at the top stanza here. So things like end-to-end testing, reducing human intervention and the need for or the likelihood of human error, quickening time to production. Those different concepts can be applied for DevOps, CI/CD pipelines, effective code management, and so on and so forth. So if we kind of think about DevOps in the terms of Synapse, particularly when we're thinking about Synapse, which effectively has all the parts, has data storage, data processing, or reporting and analytics, all in under one umbrella. How are you kind of effectively managing your deployments and your, I guess, management of that system? So what type of new processes might need to be put in place to have the appropriate gates to move between environments, or to realize where there are dependencies. Particularly for these end-to-end systems, there could be a single table or a single object in a data lake. There could be 10 dependencies or 20 dependencies of downstream applications. What type of kind of controls need to be put in place as we're changing that? So what does the kind of change management look like? What type of approval or type of testing needs to be accomplished in order to kind of deploy a change to a new environment? So I think certainly DevOps has and those principles, those concepts provide us a way to make changes to the cloud, particularly. But with Synapse, we're thinking about how that needs to be managed and what type of controls need to be in place. I think this will be a common thing, but Synapse might also present an opportunity to converge a lot of different methodologies or processes into one. So if we're kind of centralizing a lot of these, our ETL and our data storage and our relational models into one place, is there an opportunity then to kind of converge some DevOps processes to realize some synergies and some kind of more effective ways to perform DevOps? It'll be an interesting kind of interesting to see kind of what changes, what new skills need to be developed, what new types of processes need to be put in place for us to effectively manage Synapse from a DevOps perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your point around sort of that change management evolution feeds into the next topic that I want to talk about, because I think that the DevOps component is going to be key to sort of the enablement and sort of that speed to insights. However, I think there's also the change management component that's going to go along with just the fact that Synapse is a bit different in terms of it's kind of a hybrid between your traditional environment from like a traditional data warehousing and big data analytics. So it's bringing everything into one location. And so I think that if you start to think about how this could affect your different environments and what you're maintaining, there may need to be some additional change management there as well from what organizations have typically seen, sort of how they've managed warehouses versus how they've managed those big data experimentation environments. So one of the main points I think to think about here is that traditionally, if you think about all of your low environments, right, so if you have your dev, your QA, your UAT, your pre-pod, you haven't always necessarily stored all of the data that you might need for, let's say, in your lower environments, right? So dev might not be a full copy of production at any given point in time, which makes sense because warehousing costs are going to be affected by how much data you're storing at a given point in time. So if you don't need it, why would you hold on to it? So I think Synapse is going to be a bit different from that mindset, because if you're going to want to fully use the tool for what it's meant to be used for those analytics capabilities, data quality and having as much historical data as possible are going to be really important to enabling that data exploration and some of those hypothesis testing that data scientists are used to doing. They're not going to be able to work with 1 month's worth of data, right, or sort of one snapshot of data. They're going to need everything in there in any of the environments that they're working in. So thinking about that, we would think that organizations should be asking themselves, how do I make sure that I even have enough of these experimentation environments for, let's say I'm hiring 10 data scientists next year, how do I make sure that they have what they need and I'm not just sort of uselessly storing information in lower environments that nobody's accessing anymore, because that's how I used to do it, data warehouse on Azure DW. Some of the other points to think about here will be how many environments do you actually need, right? So if everything is getting consolidated and you've been able to go through sort of a code review, you've been able to optimize, you've been able to sort of downsize maybe the number of pipelines you're maintaining at a point in time, hopefully reducing some redundancy in that business logic that you're doing, the modeling components. I think thinking about how many that you'll actually need for how many data scientists you're going to have, how many data engineers working in those environments will be huge because you could potentially save quite a bit in terms of cost. And then I think the other side of it, from an environment's perspective, if you are maintaining, let's say, those sort of 5 standard environments across the board right now for your data warehouse, I think thinking about the costs of migrating all of those existing ones should not be left off of the table because it could be sizable. And then one of the other sort of key points to call out here is that Synapse is going to be unique in that it's giving you one tool to manage productionized systems and sort of there's more like lab experimentation systems. So I think a key component of that will be, how do I manage those separate environments? Do I have the same team supporting them? Do I need to align? Do I need to maybe skill up on certain skill sets? I think those are all things that organizations can start thinking about now, even if the tool is still in preview mode. And then coming to that point around productionization, I think what I'm really excited about personally with Synapse is the opportunity that's going to present for rapid productionization of data science models. So I think one of the main challenges that Ben and I have seen quite a bit on getting projects off the ground is actually taking that, that experimentation, that POC, right, that sort of key insights model that was built maybe in a more lab-facing environment off the ground and productionizing it end to end. I think Synapse is going to actually give organizations the ability to do that more quickly. However, if the end-to-end isn't built properly, it's going to be very difficult to do so. And then the final point here I think to think about is that what we've seen right now, I think it's over the past year or so in the industry, is that a lot of organizations are beginning to shift from that sort of experimentation and lab mindset to production delivery. So Synapse is going to be sort of key for accelerating that shift. But the point, you really need to get the end-to-end right in order to be able to do that efficiently.
I was going to kind of make the point around different users and personas that exist within an organization, and coming to the next slide. We're thinking about what our data science needs, what do our data engineer needs, what are our just report generators or data consumers needs, and I think that thinks about kind of your environments and who has access to what. If we are kind of then coming into kind of access and roles, which we'll talk about here.
Yeah, absolutely. So taking it to the next level, right, of, okay, I've made a decision about how many environments I'm going to maintain. I have these ones set up for the data scientists, and this is how I'm going to use MLOps to scale it, to productionize these solutions. Who needs access to what is going to be a huge question that organizations are going to have to address. And I think what's interesting about this is what we've seen, at least, is it's pretty easy to right now control access separately to Data Factory versus Databricks versus Azure ML versus Azure Data Lake Storage. But with sort of everything coming together into one place, it's going to be a bit more interesting because companies might have to start thinking about and making harder decisions around, okay, this is the actual cutoff for access. This is the type of access we're getting in people. And then I think sort of taking it to the next level of then, all right, and this is how we're going to manage it. I think there is a bit of opportunity to try to consolidate the access. So I think sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming just in terms of like confusing for maybe potentially business users who don't have all of the sort of the technical experience with all the tools. Maybe they just need access to one thing. So you don't want to compromise data security. Obviously, you can't really just open everything up to everyone. There might be specific regional needs for different areas of the business that can only access one thing. But I think that this is something to think about in terms of this type of tool where it's bringing everything into one place. How can you also use it to enable greater data democratization for your organization as well? And I think access will play a huge role in that.
And it always comes down to kind of maintainability and simplicity versus, following your rules of least privilege and having that ability to hide sensitive data or follow it. So it's always a bit of a balancing game with access of giving people the right amount of leeway without compromising any security, which I think with all this apps access and different identities that Synapse can use, I think it becomes more apparent of needing to get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next point I wanted to make was around reporting. So Ben mentioned earlier, you'll be able to connect Power BI directly to Synapse now, which is going to be great because you won't have to sort of create any intermediary output steps for your data sources for Power BI. You want to create an analysis services instance every single time you want to create reporting off of a massive data set. So if you think about historically, a lot of organizations have been able to use extracts or sort of in-memory solutions to avoid having to incur costs live connections for BI tools. I think one component of this to keep in mind is that Synapse will be that live connection, so it'll be the equivalent of sort of connecting live to a data warehouse for Power BI. So I think evaluating which of your existing reports could benefit from migrating to a live connection would be valuable. So Can I sort of enhance some of these with that real-time analytics? That could be sort of a new key capability that Synapse could present from a reporting perspective. Some of the reports might not need to be migrated to a log connection, so might not be worth going through that exercise of doing that. And then I think the other point I wanted to make here was if you are paying for a ton of Azure Analysis Services instances to support your reporting needs, Synapse could ultimately provide cost savings there in that you may only really need like 1 or 2 instances of Synapse to replace what could be 6 or 7 analysis services models. So I think there is an opportunity here for cost savings. Just really need to go through it and consolidate a view of what the actual reporting needs are from a data source perspective. And then obviously scalability is going to be huge because I think one of the challenges that everybody faces is trying to align the compute that's needed for the reporting with the demand, the consumption of the compute. So, and then the other final point that I wanted to make around reporting is I think if you're thinking about Synapse, you're writing some kind of STP or you're writing, putting together a business use case for why it would be good for the organization is I think the concepts of data democratization and user empowerment. So if you think about it, if I have, 6 different data sets, some external, some internal, then I'm mapping them all together and normalizing them and then applying some business logic. And then maybe it goes to some data scientists or maybe it just goes straight to Power BI for reporting. If you could use Synapse to basically open up these types of semantic layers that I've already done all the work, I've created the pipelines, I can run them every single month, they're automated, I'm very happy with it. I could open that up to the rest of the organization to enable everyone else to be able to use that data and drive insights from it. So I think there's a huge opportunity here to drive some of that user empowerment as well for self-service. And then finally, data governance. So this is not a new concept. It's not going away, but I think it's going to be especially important for the introduction of a new tool like Synapse because I think while there's sort of a lot of opportunity in terms of sort of those new capabilities that are being introduced in the consolidation of existing tools into one instance, Synapse could be used as a vehicle to sort of drive and establish best practices for data governance. So it's kind of a chance for if organizations are struggling to sort of put governance in place after the fact, so have already started using tools but are now realizing the need for governance, or if you haven't even gotten started on some of those key Azure tools, this would be a great way to sort of drive governance as you're rolling it out because at the end of the day, everybody is going to have to learn how to use it. It's going to be a new tool. Some of the key points around governance that I've called out here that I think will be particularly important, so this isn't everything in terms of data governance, but master data management. So you don't want 6 different versions of the same dimension table sort of floating around in different instances of Synapse, for example. Data catalogs and data dictionaries. So I think what we've seen a lot of times on projects is like, you might have data engineers who really know the data sets by heart. They've worked with them for a long time. They know every single column. They know the business value for certain measures. They know how to aggregate it. And then oftentimes there may be a gap in knowledge in terms of data scientists wrapping up on new data sets that they've never seen before, wherein there's no documentation, so there's no cataloging or data dictionaries for them to get started. So there's quite a bit of sort of time delay for them to get up to speed on what they're actually looking at. So I think best practices around that type of documentation would be really helpful to have as you're sort of consolidating environments for data engineers and data scientists. And then coding best practices. So this one is more around the fact that because you are going to have so many tools that offer a bunch of different capabilities, I think a lot of teams would benefit from just having some sort of basic frameworks for like this is typically how we go about doing things in place ahead of sort of rolling things out. And then I think roles. So while documentation is great, it's only as valuable as sort of the people who are championing it, driving it forward, updating it on a regular basis, and sort of taking ownership of it. And then I think from a governance perspective, it'll also be especially important to sort of stand up logging and audit procedures at the very beginning when you start using Synapse, because I think this one's a bit tricky in that you could potentially have different sort of business units, so it would be cross-functional. So from a cross-charging perspective of resources, sort of having those conversations early on could avoid some ugly situations down the road. And then I think the final point that we wanted to make was that like data governance isn't really just a nice to have. I do think that sort of a lack of established governance practices could actually really impair organizations' abilities to get up and running with Synapse and actually harness the full power of the tool, because it could really expose, Synapse could potentially really expose where some of your faults are. So if you don't have any of those catalogs or those data dictionaries, nobody knows what the coding standards are for anything, so they're a bit confused on how to get started on things. Those could all be exposed within Synapse, and then obviously those are going to have cost and time implications. the sort of wrap-up section here, we just want to review how you can sort of get started with Synapse. So we've talked about a lot of ideas, but then how do you really get going on it if you're as excited about it to be rolled out as we are? I would definitely recommend contacting Microsoft if you want to get access to preview. You should have some kind of Microsoft rep that you can get in contact with. And then once you do get access, definitely start a POC. Get hands-on with it, get a feel for how the tools integrate together, flag any issues that you're having with it to Microsoft early on because it is still in preview. And then I would say outside of the tool itself, it'll be really important to evaluate what your business demand is for it. So I think a lot of the points that we had mentioned are going to be dependent on where you are in terms of your sort of data architecture and data strategy. So, you know, are you already using Data Factory, Azure ML, Databricks, and like on top of all this, so is it going to be sort of a business demand for migration, or is it going to be just sort of, do people even want to use this in the first place? And then obviously that goes into reviewing what you already have out there from a solutions perspective. So which ones are going to need to be migrated, what's going to be affected, where can we consolidate and optimize, and then your data strategy. So really tying into some of those governance pieces, and then also I think sort of roadmaps for, all right, if we start using it in the next 6 months, like what is our end goal from like an analytics productionization perspective in the next 5 years? Reach out to us if any questions, thoughts, feedback, comment on the session today. Thank you for attending, and we'll let you go.